kingdoms and domains. So we're going to be looking at the 6 kingdoms we see here, and no doubt you recognize some of them for sure. Animals and plants, probably fungi as well. And then we're also going to spend some time looking at protists and Archaea and bacteria as well. So let's start off by taking a look at some negative effects that different organisms have on humans. So here are 7 diseases that can cause suffering in humans, and I want to try to think of, okay, based on these 7 diseases, which of the culprits are listed below here? Which one's associated with which disease? First one, strep throat. You may have had that before. Let's have a look. So strep throat, this is what the organisms that cause it look like, and they are actually a bacteria, and that's one of the reasons why when you get strep throat you can take an antibiotic and it almost immediately, within half a day or so, starts to take effect and starts killing those bacteria, because antibiotics are great at killing bacteria. Pink eye. This is actually a viral infection. One of the reasons why it's really contagious is because these viral particles are able to spread really easily, and things like antibiotics don't work particularly well on viruses, so we do have to have other ways of dealing with them. Also, viruses are not themselves an organism. They are not themselves alive. They can only reproduce within a living cell. Athlete's foot, another pleasant disease that humans can get, is actually a fungus. And so this one's very dependent on the conditions. So yes, it could be contagious. You could pick this up from somewhere else, but it is really dependent on the conditions in order to survive. Cold sores are another virus as well, and so again, they themselves are not alive themselves, but they can only function once they've made their way into a living cell. Flu virus is probably one that you know. So influenza is a virus, as is coronaviruses, as we can see that we're suffering from at the moment. Mad cow disease is actually a very interesting one, because it's even more simple than a virus. It's a prion. A virus itself is not alive, and a prion is even more simple than a virus, but it can cause disease. It is a self-replicating bit of material that can get in and disrupt how cells work and have neurological damages due to it. Malaria, another huge disease around the world, and this particular one is carried by mosquitoes. The mosquitoes themselves don't cause the disease. It is the protists, little single-celled organisms, relatively complex single-celled organisms, that get inside the mosquitoes, and then the mosquitoes spread them from person to person. The group Archaea that we're going to look at are currently not known to cause any diseases, and plants and animals do cause harm. So things like poison oak and giant hogweed can cause some pretty severe burns. We don't really classify them as diseases, but plants and animals do cause harm, but not quite diseases. All right, so let's take a look at these. So Linnaeus separated living organisms just into 2 groups. Very quickly we realized that plants and animals, although a lot of living things that we can sort of walk around and have a look at, will fit into those 2 kingdoms. There's a lot that aren't going to fit into those 2 kingdoms. So Kingdom Protista was added once we were able to see, using a microscope, all of the diverse life that lives on a very small scale. And so once we could start seeing them and seeing what they did and how they went about living, where they got their food from, we said, okay, well, these aren't quite plants, they're not quite animals, so let's give them their own category. We'll call it Protista. Molds and yeasts originally were thought to be plants, but because they don't make their own food, they're not autotrophs, and so they got their own kingdom as well. So all fungi fit into that, and at that point we had those 4 kingdoms. Bacteria, once we figured out sort of germ theory and figured out what bacteria were doing, we originally put them all into one kingdom, Monera. So if you're reading a really old book or something like that, they may refer to them as a monomer as a particular kingdom. But we have since classified them into two separate kingdoms. So there's the eubacteria and the Archaea bacteria, which are, yes, both very small, simple organisms, but they're very, very distantly related to each other. So if you look at sort of a little bit of a phylogenetic tree, we have Archaea bacteria on one side, eubacteria on the other side, and then Protista with our plants and our animals and our fungi sort of coming from that. So very, very simple look at the 6 kingdoms. In terms of cell type, prokaryotic cells, they don't have a membrane-bound organelles. They don't have parts in them that are held together or surrounded by an organelle themselves. Eukaryotic cells do have that membrane-bound organelle. So if you think of some organelles like a nucleus or a mitochondria, they have membranes around them. If you're talking eukaryotic cells, you wouldn't have those same structures in prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are much smaller, much more simple. So a prokaryotic cell tends to have, say, its DNA in a nucleoid, which is not bound by membrane, whereas a eukaryotic cell has a really complex nucleus with a membrane around it, as well as things like mitochondria or chloroplasts that also would have their own membranes around them. So 3 domains of life. We can so we have the 6 kingdoms, but we can organize them into 3 domains. The plants, animals, protista, and fungi, these guys are eukarya. They have relatively large, complex cells. They could be unicellular, but they are going to be relatively large, complex cells. Bacteria, these are the prokaryote cells. They definitely are unicellular, and there's a huge amount of them, a large variety of them, but they do tend to be relatively small, relatively simple, very, very diverse. And Archaea bacteria are sometimes called just Archaea. These are known as the ancient bacteria. They are also unicellular, and they tend to live in extreme conditions. So when we talk about finding life in like volcanoes or thermal vents or frozen in ice for a million years, it's probably these guys here that they're talking about. A really simple, really old type of single-celled organisms that do really well in extreme conditions where other life would have a hard time surviving.